the humorous superego and its politics of resistance. Which form of political practice best fits this notion of subjectivity? Since, on the one hand, the liberal democratic state is here to stay, that is, since the attempts to abolish the state failed miserably, and since, on the other hand, the motivational deficit with regard to the institutions of liberal democracy is irreducible, the new politics has to be located at a distance from the state, a politics of resistance to the state, of bombarding the state with impossible demands, of denouncing the limitations of state mechanisms. The main argument for the extra-statal status of the politics of resistance is its link to the metapolitical ethical dimension of the infinitely demanding call for justice. Every state politics has to betray this infinity, since its ultimate goal is the real political one of securing the state's reproduction, its economic growth, public safety, and so on. This is Antigone versus Creon. Creon stands for the raison d'etat. His concern is a totally respectable one, that of preventing another round of civil war which may destroy the city. As such, he has to oppose Antigone, whose unconditional ethical demand ignores the mortal threat its fulfillment poses to the city. Critchley refers positively to the young Marxist critique of Hegel, where Marx opposes the true democracy of the social link of free people to the state as the imposed unity. However, in contrast to Marx, whose aim is to abolish the state for this reason, for Critchley, true democracy is only possible as the interstitial distance within the state. Such a true democracy calls the state into question and calls the established order to account, not in order to do away with the state, desirable though that may well be in some utopian sense, but in order to better it or attenuate its malicious effect. Such politics is negative in the sense that it should not seek to set itself up as the new hegemonic principle of political organization, but remains the negation of totality and not the affirmation of a new totality. Anarchy is a radical disturbance of the state, a disruption of the state's attempt to set itself up or erect itself into a whole. Thus, democracy is not a fixed political form of society, but rather the deformation of society from itself through the act of material political manifestation. If, then, politics, as the aesthetic carnivalesque manifestation of the anarchic demos, and democracy are two names for the same thing, what does this mean for democracy as the state form? When Critchley writes that the motivational deficit with regard to the institutions of liberal democracy, the growing indifference towards elections and so on, has also had positive effects, giving rise to a series of non-electoral political activities, of NGOs, of social movements such as the anti-globalization movement, the indigenous rights movements in Mexico and Australia, and so forth, his position becomes ambiguous. Is it actually better for emancipatory politics if people are not committed to the democratic institutions? So what then should, say, the Democrats do in the US? Should they withdraw, subtract themselves from competing for the state power into the interstices of state, leaving state power to Republicans, and engage in anarchistic resistance to it? Of course, history is habitually written by the people with the guns and sticks, and one cannot expect to defeat them with mocking satire and feather dusters. Yet, as the history of ultra-leftist active nihilism eloquently shows, one is lost the moment one picks up the guns and sticks. Anarchic political resistance should not seek to mimic and mirror the archic violent sovereignty it opposes. But Critchley would certainly support picking up the guns and sticks when one faces an adversary like Hitler, would he not? Surely in this case one should mimic and mirror the archic violent sovereignty one opposes. So what should the left do? Distinguish the cases when one joins forces with the state in resorting to violence from the cases when all one can do and should do is use mocking satire and feather dusters? When Critchley writes that one should approach Al-Qaeda with the words and actions of bin Laden resonating against those of Lenin, Blanqui, Mao, and makes the same point at the book's conclusion with the claim that neo-Leninism is practically expressed in the vanguardism of groups like Al-Qaeda, he engages in the purest ideological formalism, blurring the crucial difference between two opposed political logics: radical egalitarian violence, what Badiou calls the eternal idea of the politics of revolutionary justice, at work from the ancient Chinese legists through Jacobins to Lenin and Mao, and anti-modernist fundamentalist violence, a new version of the old liberal conservative identification of right and left totalitarianism. Furthermore, according to Critchley, not only is the state here to stay, the same holds for capitalism itself. Capitalist dislocation, in its ruthless destruction of the bonds of tradition, local belonging, family, and kinship structures that one might have considered natural, reveals the contingency of social life, that is, its structured character, which is to say, its political articulation. Once the ideological illusions of the natural have been stripped away and revealed as contingent formations by capitalist dislocation, where freedom, for example, becomes the precarious experience of insecurity when one sells oneself on a labor market, then the only cement that holds political identities together is a hegemonic link. The unintended implication of this reasoning is that the very anti-essentialist experience of social life as contingent, with every identity the result of discursive articulation, the outcome of an open struggle for hegemony, is grounded in the essentialist predominance of capitalism, which itself no longer appears as one of possible modes of production, but as simply the neutral background of the open process of contingent re-articulations. According to this view, capitalism means permanent multiple dislocations, and this dislocation opens up the space for the formation of new political subjectivities. However, it is no longer possible to contain these subjectivities under the heading of the proletariat. Multiple dislocations clear the space for multiple subjectivities: threatened indigenous populations, sexual and ethnic minorities, slum dwellers, and so on. And what we should aim at is the chain of equivalences between these series of demands grievances. As an exemplary case of creating a new political subjectivity through an act of naming, Critchley celebrates the impoverished Mexican peasants' reinvention as indigenous people. Is it not, however, that his example demonstrates its own limitations? As his own analysis makes clear, the poor peasants had to rename themselves as the indigenous people because the successful neoliberal ideological offensive had made a direct reference to the economic position of being exploited, untenable, ineffective. In our post-political epoch of the culturalization of the political, the only way to formulate one's complaint is at the level of cultural and/or ethnic demands. Exploited workers become immigrants whose otherness is oppressed, and so forth. The price we pay for this operation is at least a minimal level of ideological mystification. What the poor peasants are defending appears as their natural, ethnic, substantial identity. The contemporary liberal democratic state and the infinitely demanding anarchistic politics are thus engaged in a relationship of mutual parasitism. The state externalizes its ethical self-consciousness in an extrastatal ethico-political agency, and this agency externalizes its claim to effectiveness in the state. Anarchic agents do the ethical thinking for the state, and the state does the work of really running and regulating society. The way Critchley's anarchic ethico-political agent relates to the superego is double. Not only is it crushed by the superego, it also acts itself like a superego agent, comfortably bombarding the state with superego demands. And the state is all the more guilty, the more it tries to comply with its demands. In compliance with this superego logic, the anarchic extrastatal agents focus their protests not on open dictatorships, but on the hypocrisy of liberal democracies, which are accused of not following consistently their own ideological norms. What Critchley offers is thus liberal capitalist democracy with a human face. We remain firmly within the Fukuyama universe, or to paraphrase Thomas de Quincey's Simple Art of Murder, look how many people started with a wrong reading of Lacan and ended up celebrating Princess Diana as a figure of insurgency. The lesson here is that the truly subversive thing is not to insist on infinite demands we know those in power cannot fulfill. Since they also know that we know it, such an infinitely demanding attitude is easily acceptable for those in power. So wonderful that, with your critical demands, you remind us what kind of world we would all like to live in. Unfortunately, however, we live in the real world, where we are just honestly doing what is possible. But, on the contrary, to bombard those in power with strategically well-selected, precise, finite demands, which cannot allow for the same excuse.